Hello, I'm Ian Thatcher. I'm Reader of Modern European History at Brunel University. I've been studying the Russian Revolution for far longer than I care to remember, and the topic of today's talk is the Russian Provisional Government, 1917. High hopes were placed upon the Russian Provisional Government in February-March 1917. The idea of the composition of a provisional government to replace Tsar Nicholas II, should he fall from power, had been discussed from the autumn of 1915 onwards. The composition of this government was therefore relatively well known. It would include Guchkov, a representative of the Moscow industrialists, Kerensky, a popular socialist, Milyukov, a representative of the liberal intelligentsia. And this particular combination of people was very, very worrying to important interest groups at this time. The Germans, for example, were incredibly worried that Tsar Nicholas II would fall and would be replaced by such a provisional government. Lenin also was extremely concerned about this possibility, and he learnt of this possibility from the German General Staff. In 1916, Lenin published in one of his newspapers the likely composition of a post-Tsarist administration, in this way trying to bring this to the attention of the Tsarist secret police in the hope that they would then arrest these key figures, thus preventing a revolution and the formation of a provisional government. Lenin and the Germans were so worried because they thought, heavens, here we have labour, capital, the intelligentsia, amounting to a government of national unity. And they thought such a popular government of national unity would be incredibly successful at pursuing the war. Very bad news for the Germans. They also thought that this would prevent a more radical revolution. And Lenin, of course, wanted to turn the First World War into a civil war, into a socialist revolution. So such a government of national unity would also prevent a socialist revolution in Russia. So important interest groups were incredibly worried by the formation of a provisional government. And when the Tsar fell and this provisional government was formed, it was universally welcomed. It was immediately recognised by the Allies, for example. It was also welcomed by the Orthodox Church, that held services across the Russian Empire in which priests give praise of thanks for the formation of this new government. So there were incredibly high hopes placed upon this government of national unity. And yet, historians write predominantly about the provisional government as a failure. They also actually have given very little attention to the provisional government. So if a student were to come to me and say, what reading do you recommend on the provisional government, there is no single monograph dedicated to the Russian Provisional Government 1917. Such historical inattention, I think, is to be explained by the notion of failure. So historians have dashed to explain the success of the Bolsheviks. So we have numerous books on the Bolshevik Party, we have numerous books on Lenin. And yet, we have here a real gap in the historiography, because to really understand the Russian Revolution of 1917, we must understand the fate of this Russian provisional government. In this talk, I want to offer two basic types of reasons why the provisional government was not as successful as the hopes placed upon it at the time. Predominantly, my emphasis will be upon reasons external to the provisional government, because when I think we add all of these external reasons up, we come to a situation in which any liberal democratic government would have found it incredibly difficult to establish itself in the Russia of 1917. Having said that, there were some political mistakes of huge proportions committed by various leaders within this provisional government, and we must acknowledge them as well. So first of all, the reasons external to the provisional government. Reason number one, it hits one straight in the face, and this is the war. The war was won and lost, I would argue, in the First World War on the Eastern Front. So the Tsar has been criticised by historians for failure as military leader. It was largely the decision to take over the army, it is argued, and the military defeats that followed that did for the Tsar in the popular imagination. Well, that ignores the extent to which Russia absorbed the majority of German forces in the First World War, that actually Russia was incredibly successful at withholding a German victory. So the provisional government, with its connections with the Allies, was still committed to this war. And what it meant was enormous resources would still have to be channeled towards feeding these 10 million soldiers, to clothing these 10 million soldiers, to entertaining these soldiers, to actually continuing military operations. The worst thing that can happen with soldiers is when they are confined to barracks with nothing to do. Because that is when they rebel. That is when discipline breaks down. So the provisional government was absolutely tied to this war. In the Russian popular imagination, in the popular politics of the day, there was a demand for peace, undoubtedly. But it was a demand for peace that had particular conditions applied to it. The Russians would not have been prepared for a dishonourable peace. They would not have been prepared to stomach a peace in which incredibly harsh terms were placed upon the Russian Empire. Now, in 1917, nobody was going to go for peace with honour. Both the Entente and the Central Powers were committed to the war and committed to victory in the war. So the provisional government had no way out of this war in an honourable sense. It was completely tied to this war, and it was tied to the war for circumstances outside its control. And although the Allies were pressurising the provisional government to stay in the war, at the same time the Allies were not prepared to do anything on the Western Front, in terms of increased activity, to take pressure away from the Eastern Front. So the provisional government was caught in the bind of staying in the war with all of the resource pressures and political pressures that went alongside that without any aid from anywhere else. So the war and the continuation of the war is a very large external reason undermining the stability of the provisional government. A second reason external to the provisional government is the disintegration of the Russian Empire after the fall of Tsarism. Nationalism. There are two types of nationalism in the Russian Empire of this time. Aspects of the empire which are going for complete independence from the empire, and parts of the empire that are moving towards increased autonomy. Parts of the empire that are going for complete independence include Finland, Poland. The Ukraine was going for increased autonomy at this time through the formation of the Rada, specifically Ukrainian parliament. And what that meant was the provisional government lost control over Ukrainian resources. It's the breadbasket of Europe, the grain resources, industrial resources, human resources. So in this process of the disintegration of the Russian Empire after the fall of the Tsar, any government, and the provisional government included, could not assert its authority across the empire. It could not guarantee the supplies that it needed to guarantee for the war effort and to supply the towns as well. A third external reason to the provisional government is particular changes within the rural environment at this time. The vast majority of the Russian Empire's population live in villages. The rural economy is absolutely key to the survival of regimes at this time. A government that cannot control the movement of grain to supply the workers in the towns and the army is very quickly going to become an unpopular government, a government at risk of disintegration. Now, various changes are taking place in the Russian countryside post-February 1917. One is a rural revolution that signifies the end of the Stolley Pin Reforms. The Stolley Pin Reforms that had been pursued from 1906 onwards, that were about the formation of a class of independent landowners in the Russian countryside to reduce the power and influence of the commune and to increase agricultural production. Now, the so-called separators were always an unpopular group within the Russian villages. What the breakdown of government authority in 1917 enabled the villagers to do is to move en masse against the separators. So there was a large amount of rural violence associated with this process, as the land that had been taken out of the commune by the separators was taken by force and reintegrated into the commune. This level of rural violence was exacerbated by the return of soldiers to the villages as the army disintegrated. These soldiers had been transformed both in terms of their consciousness. They were much aware of a broader world, they had gained independence through this process, and they were also carrying arms. They had rifles. So these people returned to the villages in 1917, and what they demanded was the establishment of their own farmsteads, their own households, in which they were going to rule. So there was tremendous generational conflict within the village at this time, as young armed soldiers returned to the villages to take power away from their elders and establish their own homesteads. A third reason external to the provisional government is what the social changes that were occurring in the Russian countryside at this time. The rural constituency is absolutely vital to the stability and survival of regimes in Russia. A government that cannot control the movement of grain, that cannot guarantee supplies to the city and to the army, is going to fail. Several things were occurring that were disrupting the command structure from the government to the countryside. One was a social revolution that signified the end of the Stolley Pin Reforms. They had been pursued from 1906 onwards, and they were about the establishment of a class of independent landowners in the Russian countryside that were meant to do away with the authority of the commune and become a successful entrepreneurial group. These separators were always resented by the commune, and with the breakdown of governmental authority post-February 1917, the villagers took advantage of this to move en masse against the separators. The reintegration of separator land into the commune was an incredibly violent process that included in numerous cases the murder of certain individuals. This inevitably disrupted production in the countryside. It inevitably led to the spread of lawlessness in the countryside. A second factor that exacerbated the level of lawlessness was the return of soldiers to the villages with the rise in desertion as a consequence of the disintegration of the army post-February 1917. These young peasants in uniform returned to the villages transformed individuals. They were transformed in their consciousness. They had gained the spirit of freedom. They had new experiences of a wider world. They were confident. They also, importantly, carried guns. They had weapons. And they were willing to use these weapons to assert their authority in the village against landowners and against village elders. This was a time when these young men were going to establish their own homesteads, assert their own authority. So this meant tremendous generational conflict within the village. And intra-peasantry violence for these various reasons led to a breakdown in production. It led to a breakdown in exchange. The peasants were incredibly self-obsessed with their own interests at this time. Now, some historians say that this meant that the villagers lacked the consciousness necessary to put a general rule of law above their own sectional interests. So Russia at this point lacked the prerequisites of a correct civil society for a functioning bourgeois democracy. So a provisional government that is about the establishment of such a democracy is going to fail because society is not ready to observe the rule of law. I think there's also a much more fundamental economic problem going on here as well. That peasants would only willingly market their grain if the terms of exchange were in their favour. And what that meant was they had to have sufficient profits from the sale of grain to buy industrial products that they could not produce for themselves in the countryside. In 1917 onwards, neither of those conditions were in place. Industrial production was predominantly for the war effort, it was not for internal exchange with the peasants, and also governments, because of the financial pressures of war, were not able to pay the price that peasants wanted for their grain. Therefore, governments tried to establish state levels of price for grain that peasants were not willing to trade in. So there was essentially war between the internal regime, the government, and the peasants. Now, in the conditions of lawlessness that were outside the control of the government could not guarantee control of the countryside. It could not guarantee terms of trade.